record this. And today's workshop is going to be about the teeth in the judicial codes of conduct. So to talk a little bit about PMC first, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that just envisions a judicial system that has fairness, accessibility, and impartiality for all people that involve. So we really like to host these workshops to help people navigate the courts with confidence. We are hosting this in partnership with Shane. I'll let him do a little introduction of himself from the Free Library.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Shane Manthe, and I'm a librarian at the Free Library of Philadelphia as a co-host today. So I just wanted to share a little bit about our resources at the Free Library System, which are available to all Pennsylvania residents. We have a large amount of circulating materials on legal topics. So books about divorce, wills, real estate, contract and business law. And we also have a government publications collection with complete collections of the United States Code annotated, the Code of Federal Regulations, Purdon's Pennsylvania statutes, and the Pennsylvania Code. We also have various court rules. So we're very happy to find those resources for you and provide them, and also connect you with other legal professionals. So if you'd like to find out more or just chat with us, please contact or find out more information at freelibrary.org. Thank you very much, and I'd like to hand it back over to Ona to continue.
Thank you, Shane. So before I introduce our two speakers, I'm just going to go over some programming that we have coming up. PMC keeps really busy, so we have a wide array of topics that we cover. So for July, we have how to administer an estate, expungement, our one-day law school for journalists coming up, navigating and understanding PA courts, and then in August, we have things like family court and criminal court coming up. So if you want to check these out, you can go on our website at www.pmconline.com under our event section. A lot of them are either hybrid or virtual, so anyone is able to access them. So without further ado, I want to introduce our two speakers. We have Alicia Hickok, who is a very distinguished and experienced attorney. She has over 20 years of experience working in the courts and just all things surrounding the legal system. She's currently on the Deputy Counsel for the Pennsylvania Supreme Court under the appellate courts, and she has lots of experience. We also have Deborah Gross, who is also a very distinguished attorney and the CEO of our organization. So I'm going to hand it over to them to talk a little bit about this workshop and also give a little bit of introduction as well.
Great. Thank you, Anna, very much. Thank you, Shane, and our partnership with the library. It's something that we truly value. So today is an interesting program, especially given how much you hear in the news. We're talking about are there teeth in the judicial code of conduct? But even a step back, what are the judicial code of conduct? What are the rules? Do judges have rules that guide their behavior, right? So, and we have two courts in our two court systems, I'll say, in Pennsylvania. One is the federal system, which is a system that is across the United States. We hear a lot about the U.S. Supreme Court. Then we have an appellate court that's directly under that. And in Pennsylvania, we have the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, and the lower court in Philadelphia is the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. It's a district court. Pennsylvania, we have three different district courthouses, I'll say. Well, actually, we have more than that, but three different district court divisions. One is the Western District, one is the Middle District, and one is the Eastern District. So Alicia's going to start off with a discussion of the federal judiciary, but I may interrupt and ask questions. And that reminds me, if any of you have questions, please put them in the chat. We will gladly answer them. And then after we discuss the federal judiciary, we'll discuss the state judiciary, because it's not the same code of conduct for federal and state judges. So Alicia, welcome. Thank you so very much.
Well, thank you. And one quick correction, I'm actually a member of the Appellate Rules Committee, not deputy counsel anymore. So with that, let's get started. If you want to go to the next slide, please. So yours is different from mine.
Yeah, Anna, she had sent a different one.
Oh,
Okay.
okay.
Okay, hold on. Let me see if I can pull it up. Hold on.
So while we're waiting for it, I'll just talk a little bit about why we care about the Code of Conduct. In part, it's because the federal Constitution guarantees to us that we have a right to an impartial judge. And that right's protected by both the Fifth and the 14th Amendment. And one of the recent Supreme Court cases that talks about it says that because it's so difficult to inquire into actual bias, and the inquiry is often a private one, there must be objective rules. And so those objective rules are part of what we're going to talk about today. And I think we're going to start.
Hold on, I'm gonna get there. I'm almost
Okay.
there. From the beginning. Okay, there we go. There you go.
Okay, and if we can go to the next slide. One of the most important protections is the statutory protection, which is that if a judge knows that their impartiality could reasonably be questioned, then the judge will say, I shouldn't be hearing this case. And that is a statutory provision to protect the impartiality of the judge. However, that decision is made by the judge themselves. It can be reviewed by the next court up. And as Debbie was saying, we have bankruptcy courts, district courts, courts of appeals, and the Supreme Court. So you can get review of that decision, but it is a decision that is in the first instance made by the judge themselves. So if we go to the next slide, please. There is a code of conduct for U.S. judges that talks about judicial integrity and independence. And you have a link here, but we're also going to be posting the slides so that you can look at it. And the values that are protected in the code of conduct are values such as diligence, impartiality, being careful what kinds of activities a judge does outside, and the fact that being improper isn't a measure just of your action, it's also of the appearance of impropriety. And so if a judge has personal knowledge of disputed facts or bias, or was involved in the case earlier, or has a financial interest, the judge cannot be considered to be impartial, and the judge needs to be removed. All right, if we can go to the next slide. There is another statute that is there and is accessible to anyone to access. And that is a process by which you can file a complaint about a federal judge. Now, judge here is a judge of the bankruptcy court, a judge of the district court, or a judge of the Court of Appeals. And we're going to talk about the Supreme Court later. But this is primarily that you can file a complaint against the other judges. And when that complaint comes, I think actually the next one gives us 2 down. We can skip to 2 down. That one gives us a really good idea of what happens. Someone, and it can be anyone, will file a complaint, and the chief judge of the circuit will review it and will either appoint a special committee or will issue an order saying that the complaint isn't merited. The special committee would then go to the Judicial Council and file a report. It would be considered, and then they could subject the court to subject the judge to discipline or ask the judge to resign. So it is something that empowers all of us to look at how to work with judges. Now let's talk about
Alicia, I'm just going
sorry.
to interrupt for one second and say,
Absolutely.
if you want to know where to file a complaint, it's on the it's on the district court's website. So in Philadelphia, it's www.paed.courts.gov, right, .courts.gov. But it's not a very complicated process, so you shouldn't be intimidated by it. But what I want to emphasize is how Alicia said it has to do with bias and conduct and impartiality. Doesn't have to do with being displeased with a judicial decision, right? This has to do with judicial conduct or disability. Sorry, Alicia.
No, that's great. And we'll get to that a little more later as well, because that's a very important distinction that you just made. So if we can go to the next slide. One of the ways that you protect the independence of the judiciary is by being very careful about how they earn money. They're paid as federal employees. Because of that, that's what they get. That's disclosed. And anything they get outside of that, they also have to disclose. And there are very strict limits on what kinds of income they can earn or what kind of outside employment they can engage in. And there's a whole series of regulations. You've got a link here. And again, we'll post those that tell you what kinds of things they can and cannot do. If we go to the next slide.
Yeah.
So these regulations govern how you can get financial disclosure reports and what financial disclosure reports every judge and every judiciary employee is required to file. And those will tell you where they got any income, who gave them money, all of that's reported there. So all of that is part of the public transparency of understanding whether there are interests that a judge has besides just what you see when they sit in front of you in the courtroom. Okay, we have a question in the chat talking about the judges in Pennsylvania. And right now we're only talking about the federal judiciary. There are regulations that govern state as well. And Debbie's going to talk about those in a few minutes. But this link will only take you to the federal. Okay, if we go further. Okay, so there are regulations on income. There are also regulations on gifts. The way gifts are defined is it's something of monetary value that's given outside of family and friend relationships or modest social hospitality. If you know a judge and you go out to lunch, you can go out to lunch and pay for the lunch, but you can't do something where you're paying a significant amount of money or doing something that would benefit the judge in any kind of way that the judge would be appearing to receive a very valuable gift from someone that was unwarranted, and especially if it appears then that their public office is being used for private gain or that they are trying to be influenced. And a judge can neither solicit nor receive gifts. If we go to,
I just want to, I had an interesting question from a reporter the other day, and I'm curious what your thoughts are, but the reporter was looking through the financial disclosure reports of judges and said to me, you know, this one judge has reported income from a trust. And, you know, is there, and I don't see any other similar disclosures from other judges. And this was a federal judge. And, you know, is there something that I should be investigating because this judge made a disclosure of income from a trust? And I'm go ahead.
You know, I was going to say that the trust, if a trust is from a family member,
right,
then they can serve as a trustee and they can be compensated as a trustee. They can't go out and, you know, I'm a judge and so I want to be on the Hershey Trust or I want to be on some other trust. They could only do trustee if it's a family trust.
Right. And they can report income, right? Because some judges actually, when they become a judge, or some individuals when they become a judge, put their money in a trust
Correct.
so that they don't see, right? Sometimes judges hold stock or investments,
Right.
and this way they don't have control or see those investments anymore, and they're in this trust. My comment to the reporter was that this was a good thing that the judge had filed this financial disclosure. And I was surprised to hear that no other judges had filed a similar financial disclosure. And I said, that sort of puts me, like perks up my interest as to why there weren't similar filings. But I wouldn't be punishing a judge who's actually sort of following the rules and doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Right, exactly.
But it's hard because you just don't know, right? You don't know what the
Yeah,
requirements are. So I actually had suggested that the reporter go to the, U.S. court website to see the rules that are
that's
involved.
great. Excellent suggestion. Wonderful. Well, one other source, if we go to the next one, we've put another link up here. There is a committee on codes of conduct who will look at the issues that are frequently raised or apply broadly and will publish formal advisory opinions. And those can be really interesting because they'll give you a set of facts and they'll say, if these come up, here is the ethical response to it. And this would not be ethical under the under the rules, whichever. It can go either way. But those opinions can be very interesting to read and very informative. And if we go to the next. So this goes back to something that Debbie said. If you look at the number of complaints and you realize how many federal judges there were a little over 1,000 in 2021, which was up 2%, maybe 30 complaints from what was filed in 2020. But one of the things to note, if you go down to the bottom, is that the allegations made most frequently actually related to the merits of the decision or ruling. And those are not actually ethical issues within the code of conduct, as Debbie was saying. So that's almost 1,000 allegations. If you look at some of the others, for example, a delayed decision, which would indicate a lack of diligence, there were only 90 of them. Hostility toward a litigant, lawyer, or judicial employee, there were only 69 of them. The other misconduct, who knows exactly what that is. But when you look at it, and you also look at the fact that prison inmates accounted for 35%, there actually are relatively few complaints that have been lodged against judges. And most of them were in the Fourth Circuit, Fifth Circuit, 11th, and 9th. And just to give you an idea, the Fourth Circuit is Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina. The Fifth Circuit is Texas, Mississippi, Alabama. The 11th is Georgia, Florida, that area. And the Ninth Circuit is out west. So it's California, Hawaii, Alaska, Oregon, Washington, those states. And so those are the ones where you got the most complaints. But again, filter it by the fact that a complaint that was related to the merits of a decision or ruling would have been filed, but it couldn't have been pursued because we want our judges to be independent. And there is a way to get review by filing an appeal, not by filing a complaint. Okay, if we can go to the next one. All right, we wanted to give you a couple of examples of judges that actually had been found to engage in misconduct. And remember, I told you that the Ninth Circuit was one of the circuits that had the most issues with judges and most complaints. Well, in this case, a judge, Judge Kindred, had been found to have had an improper relationship with the law clerk, to have continued it. And they actually asked him to resign, and he did. And so they're continuing to consider that matter. but he actually is no longer a judge for his misconduct. Now, the next one is actually a really interesting.
Yep.
So Judge Ponser is a senior judge in the District of Massachusetts, and he wrote an editorial to the New York Times and said, I'm really upset that Justice Alito has flags outside his house, one of which was upside down, one of which was, you know, an appeal to heaven flag on his vacation home. And he was actually reported for writing that article, and it was referred back to the Fourth Circuit. So Massachusetts would be in the First Circuit rather than a First Circuit judge looking at what happened with this article. They actually bounced it all the way down to that Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina circuit to look at it. And when Judge Ponser looked at what was being alleged about what he had done, he actually apologized. And when he apologized, they withdrew the complaint. And so he said that he should not have done it, which is an interesting thing because Debbie, you know, we
Yeah.
think of judges as being human too. But by making that expression, in some ways, he was making a political statement, and judges shouldn't be political.
And the question, right? And you know, this does like it goes to the question: is there? Does he have a First Amendment right? Right? Does he have a right to speak his mind? You know, the other thing that was interesting to me. So a senior judge is a little different than a regular judge, I'm going to say, right? Judges decide they choose voluntarily choose senior status, which means that they're taking a lesser caseload or they don't have to take criminal cases. And, you know, and, and the other thing that I thought interesting is that I've seen other editorials by judges, but, you know, this one was very, politically, well, they felt it was politically motivated. And as you said, you know, judges should stay out of politics.
But it's sometimes very hard to draw the line between what is political
Right.
and what is actually conviction.
Right.
And very hard to make that separation. So this was a very interesting case. Okay, if we can go to the next slide. One of the things, if you look back, it talked about judicial conduct and disability. Now, I think in part because judges are appointed for life.
Federal judges.
Federal judges, yes. Yes, sorry about that. I'm talking about the federal judiciary.
I know.
So the judges I'm talking about are appointed for life, although not bankruptcy judges. But the others are appointed for life. And so sometimes you can have a judge who is very, very aged. And many times judges actually die while they're sitting on the bench. I mean, they don't necessarily retire. And as we know, there are things that happen as people age. And sometimes you will see things like, you know, an inability to continue to focus, or sometimes, unfortunately, people will have dementia or other things that happen. And when that happens, it puts a person in a very awkward situation because all of a sudden you have somebody who's not acting as the judge they used to be, who is still presiding over cases. And those rules of conduct and disability allow a person to say, I'm observing behavior that I think is a disability. And there was a very famous one recently where Judge Newman, who had been a very renowned judge, was suspended because they believed that there was an age disability involved.
And what's interesting for this case also is that the issue was brought to the attention of the chief judge of the circuit by other judges on this judge's court, that they had concern. And I say that because it's actually it's hard to be a litigant, right? And as you know, representing a litigant and challenge the mental health of a judge. And I say that almost from personal experience. We had a judge in a class action matter that was senior and had some health issues, and like the a decision came out and it was completely confusing. Another decision took had been 3 years, hadn't come out. And so I was the plaintiff's counsel and I was working with the defense counsel, and we actually both agreed that we should let these significant matters, I'll say, motions, be heard by the magistrate, because we were both concerned with the judge's mental health. And the magistrate was terrific, very professional, very impartial. And then the magistrate's decision went to the judge, and literally the judge just copied it word for word and signed it. But that's how we as a litigant handled it, because we didn't know what would happen if we reported it.
Yeah. And it's also very hard because a lot of times these are people who have built such a strong reputation over decades, and you don't want to see something happen to tarnish that reputation.
Right.
But it's a real dilemma, and I think getting worse.
Yeah. Because I mean, this is not our topic, but when the decision was made to have judges for life, right? To have that independence of politics, people weren't living as long as they're living now. So
That's right.
it's a whole different story.
It definitely is. All right, maybe we can go on to the next one. All right, so I know everybody's thinking, well, wait a minute, what about the US Supreme Court? I mean, they don't get reviewed by the Court of Appeals, and they are the top of the level. So what happens with them? Well, as you know, a lot of questions have been raised by Congress and by others. And so in November 2023, the justices issued what they called their Code of Conduct for Justices, which they said that they took from all kinds of things, including the statutes, some of which are binding on them and some of which are not, from common law, from case law, but they articulated it in canons. And a canon is more advisory than it is mandatory. And their canons had no means of enforcement to them. The canons are just, it's really important. A justice should uphold the integrity and independence of the judiciary. Well, that's true. But what does that mean? And what happens if somebody is, thinking that didn't happen? And the second one, a judge should avoid impropriety and the appearance of impropriety in all activities and perform the duties of office fairly, impartially, and diligently. And, may engage in extrajudicial activities that are consistent with the obligations of the judicial office and refrain from political activity. Well, go back to the senior judge from Massachusetts who wrote an article saying Justice Alito shouldn't fly flags because they are political flags. Now, was the senior judge the one who was being political, or was he trying to enforce this canon that said a justice should refrain from political activity? And so, this is November 2023. And they say, well, yes, it's derived from that code of conduct that we looked at earlier, but they say it's adapted to the unique institutional setting of the Supreme Court. Well, okay, there is a unique institutional setting, but what do you do with that? So if you go to the next one, can you go to the next? Okay. So for example, this is talking about the canon on, the judicial function of recusal. And it's saying when you look at the uniqueness of the Supreme Court, you have an issue because there are 9. And there are 9 for the reason that you would get at least a 5-4. But if you recuse, you have 4-4. Under the way that the system works, 4-4 will not get you a grant of cert, and 4-4 will mean that a decision is affirmed because it's an evenly divided court. And so recusal in that setting has a different import than recusal if you're one of 16 judges and somebody else is going to pick up your caseload. And that is a unique characteristic of the Supreme Court, but it doesn't mean recusal should never happen.
And we've seen decisions recently where the Supreme Court justices, some of them have recused themselves. So this is somewhat of a, I'll say, just doesn't make sense. That's not good enough.
Well, and one of the most, if you want to go back quite a ways, one of the interesting decisions is U.S. versus Alcoa, way back in the 1940s, where the Supreme Court justices had to recuse themselves, and so the Second Circuit actually made the Supreme Court's decision.
Right.
So, there are ways.
There are ways, right. So
all right, if we can go to the next one. So the American Bar Association, which is a compilation of, any lawyer who's barred in the United States, any judge can be a member of it. It passed a resolution by its House of Delegates in February 2025 that was put forward by the New York City Bar. And it said, we want a binding ethics code that has an enforcement mechanism. And what's interesting in it is that they faulted the 2023 canons as being aspirational rather than mandatory and with no enforcement mechanism. And they said, this is not something that we can have our Supreme Court do. And they go back to what we talked about in Caperton, that impartial justice is embedded in the due process clauses of the 5th and 14th Amendment and guaranteed through the separation of powers and checks and balances. And every court, including the High Court, needs to enforce that. And in a perfect transition to Debbie, they also said that every state has judicial codes that apply to their justices. And if the states do, why doesn't the federal? Right. So Debbie, let's talk about the state.
Thank you. Right. So let's talk about the state. So there are so many different rules, right, applying to state court judges, and all of them. All right. There's not a differentiation between the magisterial district court judges. Well, that's not true. There's not a differentiation between the Court of Common Pleas judges and the appellate court judges, and it applies to the Supreme Court judges as an appellate court judge. There are a little bit of difference in the rules for magisterial district court judges, and just as a little cheat, magisterial district court judges are the entry-level judges, and they are in every county but Philadelphia. So they are, and what's also interesting in that one regard is that magisterial district court judges don't have to be attorneys. They can take a class, sit for an exam. They have to pass the exam, and then they can be a magisterial district court judge. So that is also, I guess, one of the reasons why they have a different code of conduct. The other thing that's interesting, as Alicia said, for the federal judges, like, that's their full-time job. They shouldn't need to get extra income and have a second job. Well, magisterial district judges can have other jobs. some are lawyers, some have a law practice, some are involved in real estate. So there is a big difference in Pennsylvania between magisterial district court judges and the rules and conduct, and the Court of Common Pleas, municipal court, municipal court judges, the Commonwealth, the Superior Court, and Supreme Court. So we're going to go through a few of our, I think, I have to go through it. We're going to go through the different rules and applications and codes applicable to the state judges. So, the state court judges have a code of conduct. These two are canons, but these are canons that that have a lot of have been interpreted in great depth. I will say there's a lot of notes that explain how the canons should be understood. There's actually a lot of decisions from the courts interpreting this based on different situations that have arisen, I will say. But most of these are also common sense. I mean, even the ones for the federal court, Alicia, they're common sense, right? You should have to,
Yeah.
uphold the integrity, independence, and impartiality of the judiciary. We need that. Avoid, the impropriety and appearance, avoid impropriety or any appearance of impropriety. I mean, we hold our judges up to high standards, and we should. I was talking to one judge, and he said when he became a judge, he felt like he was going into the monastery. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and Debbie, one of the things that I find interesting is that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court is very willing to discipline its own.
yeah,
It holds itself to such high standards that if a justice is not living up to those standards, actually some of the harshest opinions are about justices.
yeah. So, and how does that, and that's a great segue, because how does that lead? How do those opinions come about? How does our Supreme Court make these decisions? And so the process is such that there's a Judicial Conduct Board that was created in 1993. Now, interestingly enough, or unfortunately, I'm going to say, Pennsylvania has had in the past, has had its fair share of misconduct by judges, and decided it was time to really clamp down on judicial conduct. And so this Judicial Conduct Board was created, was amended to be an independent board, that it the appointments some were from the Supreme Court, some were independent, and that the Judicial Conduct Board is I guess has the teeth. They do the investigation after a complaint is filed. So there's a process. Let's see if I think I have it. Yeah. All right. So what the process is that somebody can file a complaint with the Judicial Conduct Board. It's it's on there's a website. It's a very easy complaint to file. It is anonymous. That's also with the federal complaint. And that's important because that, complainants or litigants should feel that they are not, that there's not this conspiracy or attempt to discredit them, but the entire investigation occurs with an anonymous complaint. So I want you to understand that. And so what happens is first we'll discuss the Judicial Conduct Board. It's 12 people. It's a 4-year term. But again, it's important. It's not only appointments by the Supreme Court. Half are appointed by the governor. So it's not a board that's controlled by the court. It's also important because it has lawyers and non-lawyers. And I think that's really important. Non-lawyers come to the table with a different point of view, sometimes a refreshing point of view, I'm going to say. And the other important requirement in this is that they can't, only half can be from the same political party. I find it interesting that it's a 12-person board, not a 13-person board, because what happens if there's a tie here, right? But this has worked in the past and has been working. So no, let's go back. So who may file a complaint, right? I just mentioned this. They are anonymous. It could be a fellow judge. It could be a court staff, a clerk. It can be a litigant. Anybody can file the complaint. It goes to this Judicial Conduct Board. The Judicial Conduct Board has its own funding, has its own operations, has its own staff. The staff actually do an initial inquiry. They do interviews. They take depositions. If they think that there is merit and it's not somebody complaining about a matter, then they can do a full investigation. At that point, the judge who's under the microscope, I'll say, is given notice of the full investigation, and there actually can be a physical and mental health exam if the concern has to do with mental health. But it is, I can't emphasize enough the thoroughness of the investigation. We had on a prior panel a woman who was on the Judicial Conduct Board. She is an attorney. She was not appointed by the Supreme Court. She was appointed by the governor. And she was very surprised at how much work, I'll say, was required of her and how much work was undertaken by the investigative team into inquiries. Like, this was something that was taken very seriously. The Judicial Conduct Board makes a determination after this full investigation. They might decide that there's just a letter of caution for this judge. There could be some kind of rehabilitative diversion. Maybe the judge had some kind of drinking issue and they wanted to resolve this. And so that would not necessarily be a public resolution. Okay. It would be that they would try to take care of this in a private manner. However, if the Judicial Conduct Board decided that this complaint merited formal charges, the Judicial Conduct Board would actually, or does actually, file formal charges against a judge in the Court of Judicial Discipline. And so, again, some statistics, right? During 2023, the board received 825 confidential requests. It only filed 2 formal charges against 2 judges, and then 1 petition for an interim suspension without pay. It closed, 796 matters. Most they found were really a lot of complaints with respect to outcome of cases. I know that we have at PMC have often gotten complaints on we have a 1-800 number, and then I reach out to people or any kind of email, and a lot of it has to do with how a judge has ruled or how a judge hasn't ruled, and the matter has been just languishing. But and again, a more substantive complaint against a judge filed with the Judicial Conduct Board is something that will merit a further investigation. And these are just websites, and we'll make these slides available. There have been, again, some recent matters, as Alicia said, like our court has not hesitated to take public hearings and matters against certain judges. So there was a judge who had been posting on his Facebook page political views. The Supreme Court actually gave him a warning at first and said, okay, this is a new issue. Maybe it hasn't been interpreted yet, but please do not. A judge cannot post political views on a Facebook page. In fact, a judge could have a Facebook page, but really that's just talking about the judge, maybe socializing, but no political views. And unfortunately, this judge didn't heed the initial, I'm going to say initial reprimand, right? It was literally just a letter or a decision that told the judge that you should not use your Facebook page to publish your political views. And so the judge ignored the Supreme Court, which is not really a good thing to do from a judge. And so this judge was suspended without pay until the end of 2024, which was the time period when he hit a mandatory retirement age. Another judge in our court, had abused her powers in essence. And so the court again, there were transcripts, there was hearing, there was testimony, and the Supreme Court, issued a formal reprimand. What's interesting with the process is that the initial part of the process is confidential, right? The complainant's complaint, the person who files the complaint, it is confidential. Who the Judicial Conduct Board interviews, what depositions it takes, everything is confidential. However, when there is a decision made that there should be formal charges, everything becomes public, which I think is very important. The other thing that's just new for Pennsylvania is a Judicial Ethics Advisory Committee. And this is so that to help answer judges' questions and prevent, I'm going to say, bad or improper conduct. So this committee was recently composed, and it's interesting when I spoke to one of the committee members, and they couldn't believe how many judges reach out to them to ask for an advisory opinion. I mean, we actually had a judge, we had asked a judge to speak at one of PMC's community education programming, and that judge reached out to the Judicial Ethics Advisory Committee to get just to get a ruling that they could teach at PMC's community programming. It's a nonpartisan event. It just was speaking about the law, and they did permit it. But there are so many other issues that have been presented before the Judicial Ethics Advisory Committee, and in fact, most recently, there was one about disqualification and refusal, and when should a judge disqualify him or herself from a proceeding, or when should the judge recuse himself from the proceeding. I have to correct that. There was also another recent guidance about elections. So in Pennsylvania, we elect our judges. So it's very hard when a judge has to go around and campaign. There's a lot of requirements on judges. So when they campaign, they can't ask for money. They can't answer certain questions. May I comment on hot button issues such as abortion, gun rights, and the death penalty? And so this advisory opinion said you can make statements or announcements about personal views, but you may not make pledges or promises that would directly or indirectly, interfere with their decision making. So a matter that could potentially come before that judge or that court, that judge could not say, I'm going to rule that way. So I think a lot of judges were asking this this commission how they can answer questions when they're campaigning, and it is definitely something that's been I know I've spoken to a number of judges, and people are getting more inquisitive and want more answers, and judges' hands are tied as to how they can answer, constituents. So I think we're actually at the end. I'm going to stop sharing. And I didn't know if there were any questions. The judicial conduct rules, apply to all state court judges, family court, orphans court, criminal court, civil court. There's no distinction among the courts.
Well, and Debbie, to follow up on a question that was asked earlier, there are also financial disclosures that are made, and those are publicly available. So you can get the financial disclosures on state judges just as you can for federal judges.
Right. So, Well, Alicia, I want to thank you for joining PMC. It's always
No,
great
thank
to see
you.
you. Anna, thank you for organizing. And Shane, thank you for the Philadelphia Free Library for hosting.